Today and this week marks a very, very important time for our nation. This past week, we saw the beginning of something that will change the course of the rest of the year. We saw the beginning of the college football season. And one of the things that we really noticed, the first couple of weeks of college football, everyone's playing non-conference games. So you have a lot of games where you've got a really, really good team that's probably going to go all the way and make it to the championship, playing a team that we probably haven't even heard of. And this happens all the time in week one. And as we were watching the games, Tori and I yesterday, that happened once again. We got to see Alabama, Tori's team, play Western Kentucky. And you're watching the game, and in the first couple of minutes a few of the kinks get worked out, but then they really hit their stride, and by halftime it was 42-0. And when I watch that game, I look at the game and say, that game's over. I mean, there's just no coming back from that. Everything that needed to be done for Bama to win that game has already happened, and there's pretty much nothing that Western Kentucky could do about it. At the same time, there's this parallel reality that while everything that needed to be done to win the game has already been done, you still have to line up 11 guys every play for the whole second half. And so sometimes it gets a little bit boring to watch as each team substitutes in their second and third and fourth string players. But it shows us this kind of interesting dynamic that we've got something that's already been finished, already been secured, and yet you still have to line up 11 people, and you still have to play every down, and you still have to run out the clock. There's still more to be done, even if that more doesn't affect the overall outcome. And it's through this lens that I want us to look at Psalm 126 this morning. A Song of Ascents. It says this: well, I should have put the bookmark where I was preaching from this morning. Here we go. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negeb. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. I have the privilege today of finishing up our Summer in the Psalms series. And we've seen so many different psalms with so many different emotional contours, and we'll see that again today. John Calvin, one of the early Protestant theologians, said that the Psalms are an anatomy for the soul. The Psalms have a unique way of being brutally honest about the human experience and about what we go through. That's what he means, the anatomy of the soul. There's no emotion or trial that we face that's not also recorded in the Psalms. There's everything from rejoicing to anger to despair and to hope. And this psalm is no different. Here we see both rejoicing and despair, both gratitude and dissatisfaction, both remembering and looking forward. First, we see that this psalm is written in gratitude of what God has done. And for this psalm in particular, the historical context is very important. The psalm was written during the post-exile period, and it reflects the situations and struggles that Israel encountered during that era. The exile, which was a direct result of the nation's disobedience to God, was one of the most trying times for the nation of Judah, which had already been significantly fragmented to this point. During the exile, Jewish people gained this unprecedented resolve to follow God and to follow his law. God, sending them into exile, God's discipline, had worked to increase their resolve and to increase their dependence on him. During this period, we see so many amazing stories of faith, great men and women like Esther and Daniel and many more. Then, in an amazing way that mirrors the exodus from Egypt, the Lord brought them back into Judah and allowed them to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. A small group of people, led by Ezra, returned to Jerusalem and to the surrounding area, beginning to rebuild the city. As they rebuilt, they faced immense pressures from the surrounding peoples, many of whom were not Jewish and didn't have a similar ancestral connection to the land that the Jews did. Eventually, because of the immense pressure from the surrounding nations, the Persian king asked them to pause the construction. And a few years after this, Nehemiah heard about the walls and the gates of Jerusalem being broken down, and he used his relationship with the Persian king to petition him to allow him to rebuild the walls. Not only did the king give permission, but he gave Nehemiah all the building resources and permits that he needed. Nehemiah's effort was successful, and he and Ezra reestablished Temple Mount worship. And when they had finished the reconstruction, there was understandably lots of celebration, but mostly from the younger generation. There was also much sorrow from the older generation that realized what was rebuilt wasn't like what was. What God had given them wasn't like what they had experienced in their childhood. And it's in this very trying time for the nation that this psalm is written. We're not certain about who wrote it, but there's a really good chance that it's written by an Old Testament figure that is known as the chronicler. The chronicler is somebody who seems to have written several Old Testament books, including 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, and potentially this individual also compiled the Psalms. The chronicler was likely somebody who returned to Judah with the exiles, and that strengthened his resolve to see the people understand and follow God's law. As we look at this psalm, verses 1 through 3 highlight so many of the great things that God has done for his people. It's really interesting. The psalmist specifically uses the word fortunes to describe the blessings that God has given. This is an interesting choice of words because the writer's perspective on the exile is shown through this. When we hear people talking about God giving them fortunes, we typically think about money, power, influence, or self-fulfillment. But the fact that the psalmist uses fortunes to describe their situation forces us to really ask ourselves what that means. What do God's blessings really look like? God blessed the returned exiles with a God-centered and worship-centered community that represented the beginnings of a restored kingdom. And in so many ways, our situation is not much different. Rather than giving them all the wealth and the influence that the nation had previously had, God simply gives them what they need. You see, the money and the power and the influence had caused Israel and Judah so many times to go astray, so many times to abandon the Lord's law. And after this exilic period, the Lord brings them back, and instead of giving them that temptation, he gives them simply what they need and asks them to trust him. And Jesus echoes this same principle in the New Testament when he tells his disciples to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And then he encourages them not to worry about the future, not to worry about what they'll eat or where they'll sleep. I think this should challenge us in our daily lives to ask what occupies our minds and our worries. What is it that concerns us? What is it that we're constantly thinking about? What is it that scares us? And what is it that gives us joy? We can get so caught up in the things of this world and in the things that are fleeting and don't last that we lose perspective for what God really wants for our lives. The psalmist also seems to focus specifically on the things that God has done immediately surrounding the writing of this psalm. this Thanksgiving seems to be focused on things that God has done for the exiles during their own lifetime. And this is really, I think, helpful for us. It's easy for us to think that the really great things God has done are the things that we read about in the scriptures, the things we read about in the Bible. And that maybe the things God has done in our lives, they're great, but they're kind of insignificant in comparison. I think we tend to have that attitude towards God's workings. But I think that the psalmist gives us a totally different perspective on that. The psalmist rejoices specifically in the things that God has done in his lifetime. The psalmist has this response to God's working of worship that's specifically grounded in God's recent action. The psalmist is well aware of how God led Moses and Joshua and Gideon and David and so many others. And yet he still celebrates what God has done for him. This also reminds us that we serve a God who is relational. He doesn't just reveal himself through the things that he did thousands of years ago, but rather he reveals himself through the things that are near to us today. It's like we just sang about a minute ago. We serve and call upon the same God of Jacob and Moses and Mary, and the God who did all of those great things in the Holy Scriptures. It's easy for us to take God's blessings for granted, but the psalmist wants us to see that it's just as important for us to celebrate and to rejoice in God's recent work. Another thing that we can clearly see is that God reveals his glory, power, and goodness to the nations. Throughout the Old Testament, God continually did great things for his people in very, very public ways so that those actions would be noticed by others and that those people might see who God is. This can sometimes be a little bit hard for us to understand. I think I struggle with this too. We're constantly told that we need to be selfless. We don't need to be self-centered. And so then we see God doing things specifically to draw attention to himself. And this can lead to questions for us. We can often mistake God's self-glorification with pride, but that's simply not the case. When we as fallen and sinful human beings bring attention to ourselves, we're bringing attention to something that is fallen, and it's insufficient to bring joy and contentment to the people that would pay attention to us. But when God brings attention to himself, he blesses the people who look on him so that they find satisfaction in him. Listen to what Psalm 34 says about this. In verse 5, David says, "Blessed are those who look to him." Those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. Then later in verse 8, he encourages the readers by saying, "Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him." So we see that God shares his glory in a very public way so that he can be enjoyed and be a blessing to those who are far off and those who would come near to him and see and experience his glory. In the final part of this first section, the psalmist once again affirms that what the nations have perceived is correct, that God truly has done great things for them. And just as God intends to make the nations take joy in him, the psalmist affirms that God's people have experienced that joy through God's deliverance. This also shows us the learned humility of the returned exiles. They were the ones who rebuilt the wall, after all. They were the ones who rebuilt the temple. They were the ones that reestablished the priesthood. And yet, all the credit rightly goes to God. This is perceived by both the Jews and by the surrounding nations. Those who are close to the work and those who are far from the work can't deny that it was God that did this. Though we can work hard on things and accomplish them, we need to have an attitude toward success that acknowledges that only God can give it. I'm going to say that again. We need to have an attitude toward success that acknowledges that only God can truly give it. And though we work, God is in control of the results. After this, we see a huge, dramatic shift in the psalm. While the first half was characterized by thanksgiving and gratitude, the psalmist then shifts to an air of discontentment. The psalmist starts by asking God to restore their fortunes. At the beginning of Psalm 126, there's a great joy because of God restoring their fortunes, and yet the psalmist appeals to God, seeking for him to restore them once more. Didn't God already restore them? What's going on here? How can we understand this statement? While God had done so many things for the people, it was clear to them that while God has been faithful, the end result wasn't complete. While God had already delivered them and reestablished them as a nation, they were still in further need of deliverance and protection. And this theme of the already and the not yet occurs over and over in Scripture. God doesn't do all of his work all at once. If that were the case, we would really only have 6 chapters of Scripture. We'd have Genesis 1 through 3, and we'd have Revelation 19 through 22. And that would pretty much be it. And yet, God reveals himself and his plan of redemption over time in a relational way that shows his goodness and his love towards his people. The psalmist then compares this love and this restoration to the Negeb region. This was a nearby, very arid and dry part of the region for most of the year. However, in a rainy season, the rain would pool up and create flowing streams in that area. And it's this kind of restoration that the people of Jerusalem are seeking. They've been a region that's had flowing streams through them in the past, but now they're in a circumstance that's dry and empty. And they need God to send his favor once again. As Christians, we often find ourselves in this kind of dry season. Though we put what God has done before us, or though we know what God has done before us, there's so many times that we don't experience that. Put simply, there's often a disconnect between what we know and our experience and our feelings. We know that we have God's favor. After all, Christ shows us that on the cross. And yet, there's still so many times that it doesn't feel like he's near. There's so many times that we feel like we don't experience the things that Christ secured for us on the cross. As Christians, we have to be patient for heaven when we'll fully experience all that God and Christ have secured for us. And while we wait, we have to trust in God's promises. It's like we sang about earlier. I will wait for you, and on your word I will rely. God hasn't given us the Bible as just this arbitrary moral instruction manual. Rather, he's given it to us to remind us of the promises he's made and to remind us of the relationship that we can have with him through Jesus Christ. This will then lead us to ask a question we've been asking over and over throughout this series. What makes this psalm sing? What makes this more than just a piece of wisdom or somebody's felt experience? What makes it more than a suggestion for how we should live life? And the thing that makes this psalm sing, we find in verses 5 and 6. It's that tearful sowing leads to joyful reaping. That forces us to ask, then, what is sowing? The first thing that I think is abundantly true about sowing is that sowing is done with the expectation that it'll yield some kind of fruit. Nobody sows and said, I'm going to go ahead and plant over here and nothing will happen. Nobody does that. We sow or we plant or we develop things with the expectation that there will be fruit later on. Sowing is the perfect analogy for faith-filled obedience because it highlights that our obedience to God is to be done with the expectation that he will use it, that he's in control of the results. At the same time, when we sow in faith, we don't always see the results. We don't always see what God's doing. When we live the Christian life, we have to be okay with not always accomplishing the goals that we want, knowing that God will use our efforts to accomplish His goals, not ours. So sowing is radically God-centered because it makes us forfeit our will and our goals and stretch us towards God's plan. One of the ways that this is so beautifully shown is Hebrews 11. This chapter is sometimes nicknamed the Hall of Faith. The writer of Hebrews spends the first 38 verses talking about specific people in the Old Testament and their faith in God. He talks about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and so many other prophets, judges, and everyday people that followed God. And then at the end of the chapter, the writer says this: all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. They didn't receive it. They didn't experience what God had promised them. Why? Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. You see, Abraham died without living in the promised city because the promised city would never be complete without the death and resurrection of Christ. Because the promised city would never have any meaning if the people coming there were still broken in their sins. All of these great heroes of the faith, they were obedient. And they trusted in God to accomplish His plan rather than being distracted by their own plans and desires. And when things were hard, as they so often were, they trusted in God. And they trusted in God's promises to them. They trusted in God to restore them like flowing streams in the desert. And so as we conclude, I think this forces us to ask ourselves who we're living for. It's so easy for us to do the same things week after week and forget why we do what we do. It's so easy for us to come to church week after week. And it's easy to come to church when you see your friends and you interact with people that you like or you interact with people that are similar to you. But what are we really here to do? What are we really meant to do in the Christian life? We're here to sow the seed for God to reap the harvest that He wills. Maybe you've been living for your own goals. Maybe you've been sowing to reap a selfish harvest. Maybe what this psalm says perfectly describes you, somebody who sows in tears. Friend, know that there's comfort in God's promises.